Good point. We know we need some transformative technological breakthroughs in many areas to achieve 2050 targets or anything like that. Is there limitations for like investing, for example, I'll just say in battery storage? It was an interesting article yesterday in the LA Times about renewables and solar and, you know, peak periods and how you store excess power in order to, because we know we want to increase our RPS standards. So is there permissible, given recent court decisions, that some money could be expended on those investing in the technology breakthroughs that we're going to need that'll be good for business in the long run?
I'm going to give an example, and it keys off of some comments I was going to make, but I think it's illustrative of the point that you're making. And that is, within the scoping plan and also within the 3-year investment plan, there was recognition of the very point that you're making. There's some opportunities very near term to reduce emissions, and I would say electric vehicles today. They're available today. In fact, the number available today is there are 25 models available today. 5 years ago, there was 1. Those clearly are available commercially. They're attractive. People are purchasing them. They're reducing GHG emissions. No doubt about that. That's completely verified and documented. And they're producing a series of other benefits, and they're in our proposal as we've advanced it. But we also recognize the point that I made earlier, which is the transportation sector in total isn't just light-duty vehicles. It's also heavy-duty vehicles, including diesel vehicles that not only emit oxides of nitrogen that contribute to ozone and GHGs, but also diesel PM. There's certain applications for lower emission diesels that are available today, but there are others that really do require demonstration projects to support those breakthroughs, because those breakthroughs can translate into significant emission reductions, health benefits, reduced exposure near disadvantaged communities, near ports and freight hubs. So we strove, consistent with the 3-year investment plan, for a portfolio, a mix of those near-term opportunities as well as some demonstration projects that can really move the ball in a significant way.
Okay, thank you. Last just observation, because I can't resist. The cap and trade, which is sometimes not understood very well in the legislature, actually came about in 2006 because of the request of the business community. This is the business community wanted to create a market-based approach. Yes, a cap in emissions, but the incentive not only to meet the targets, but exceed the targets, and then being incentivized to even reduce emissions more and have something of value to trade to others that can't. Some of the biggest businesses in the United States were in California at the time. Championing cap and trade is an important part of a regulatory approach in the overall objectives of AB 32. So it is a cap on emissions and a rollback, but the trading part, again, was welcomed by major businesses throughout the state and the country at the time. And so that's the origin and the history of that.
Yes, Senator Nielsen.
I'd like to follow on this. You see that all 3 of us are concerned about quantification and accountability here. And, you know, in terms of that, I hear amongst finance and analysts and CARB uncertainty. We really don't know. And what are the measurables? Sir, you mentioned that it'll vary by project. Well, that's going to be really tough to know. Let me narrow it down. For example, the high-speed rail that will be started, a portion of which is to begin in the Central Valley, an area of pollution concentration. How will we know that that train has done anything to clean up the air, and we're not even going to have anything until 2020? That's a lot of years we've invested maybe billions of dollars, and we don't know the product of it. How do we get a handle on this? I'm asking you folks, because I want our staff, with the majority staff, to focus on what are the measurables. If you can't come up with them, I think it's incumbent on us to ensure responsibility to the people of California. So maybe be specific to the high-speed rail, what are the measurables, and how are you going to come up with those and present them to us so we can be comforted?
And I know I'll be followed by transportation in a moment, so that they would want to amplify on this. But I want to go directly to the question in terms of what are the metrics? A key metric is GHG reductions. Use of GGRF funds requires advancement, furthering the purposes of AB 32. The projects that are in the proposed budget reduce GHG emissions. The point that I was making, and it's an important one here, is the quantification methodology isn't a one-size-fits-all. These are scientifically based estimates, and I will give you a very specific example. The example I gave for motor vehicles, cars, an EV or electric diesel, what's happening is you're replacing gasoline or diesel. You're substituting that with another energy source from the electric grid. These are calculations based on the reduced consumption. These are engineering calculations that are documented, that can be supported, that can be verified. And from those calculations, you can estimate the GHG reductions. Clearly, any project that you move forward on needs to be monitored, needs to be reported on, and DOF mentioned the recent report that was transmitted to the legislature. There's an annual report that requires that there be a status report on those projects, those agencies that receive GGRF funding. What's the status? Where are they? What's been funded? And so on. And so the checks and balances, the important checks and balances on the types of projects, the fact that they've gone through a public process to solicit and select in many of these cases, and then that there's reporting is established, and the principles for calculating GHG reductions are established as well. There's more work to do, no doubt about it, but in terms of is there a clear metric, I'd say yes, there is. And is there a principles by which to do those calculations? Yes, there are.
Unless you looked like you had something to say.
I mean, I think it's a very important issue that you've touched on, the issue of just monitoring what types of benefits are being achieved from spending this money. And I think at this point, it's fair to say it's not quite, the details of exactly how those calculations will be made, it's not quite clear yet. Yes, it's clear that what will be attempt to be measured will be greenhouse gas emission reductions and many other things, but the departments and the administration are still very much in the process of developing the details of exactly how those things will be measured and how those things will be monitored, and it's a very important thing to continue to monitor and follow up with, and we will continue to monitor as those departments develop that guidance in more detail and work with staff in ensuring that the legislature has the type of information it needs to, or that it wants to evaluate how successful these programs are and how things, how the legislature might want to change things in the future in light of that information.
Well, I think that's critical, and I'd like our staffs to work on some budget control language that keeps the pressure on it. If we just sort of, this is all we talk about it, and we wait and we come back here next year, we're going to get the same kind of stuff. Well, we don't know, and we're not sure, and we're working on it, we're working on it, we're working on it for 20 years. And we're spending billions of dollars. We can't let that happen. We need to get the quantification and those criteria established at the front end of this, I think. It is really important. Last question. The board is working on these targets, and also are you considering that if the reductions are not achieved, that then the trade funding has got to be refunded? You know, you don't meet your mark, there's a penalty. Has that been considered? A refund?
That question has arisen. Our feeling is that the departments, they're working very closely with the Air Board to make sure that the projects that are selected, the project selection criteria, uses the scientific approach, and that the projects that are selected will result in greenhouse gas emissions and other co-benefits. If for some reason a project that is purported to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the science at the front end of the project estimates that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and it fails to do so, the short answer is that we don't think that there will be repercussions. Nothing will happen. Assuming that the grantee or the state agency who spent the funds followed all grant requirements and complied with all applicable laws. If, on the other hand, there's fraud or negligence that's ultimately discovered, there are provisions in existing law for dealing with those situations. We anticipate that a project that fails to accomplish the goals should be a very rare situation because of the upfront work that is being accomplished prior to project selection.
Following up on Senator Nielsen, I think this is a very important question. I'm not talking about fraud or negligence, and I don't think Senator Nielsen was either. It's a very valid question. You're devising a methodology. There are projects being proposed, a wide variety of projects proposed, that are making estimates about GHG reduction. It's a fair question. If that doesn't occur, what happens? I mean, that's...
It is an important question, I agree.
If you don't have the answer, you ought to begin to think about that.
We are thinking about that.
Additional monies at a minimum
Shouldn't go.
If there are rare situations...
Grants should stop. I mean, I'm not sure, the top of my head.
Yeah, I just wanted,
There are a number of things that have to happen when that occurs.
Chair, I'd like to add
Yes.
one point on this, and I'm going to use an example that I provided earlier of a freight demonstration project, for instance. So freight demonstration project would be targeted, these are targeted disadvantaged communities. They're intended to not just reduce GHGs, but NOx, diesel PM. But with demonstration projects comes some uncertainty, but comes the opportunity for potential significant benefits. The way those grants are structured, though, they have interim milestones, and you just touched on this, they have interim milestones and a well-structured grant. And if those milestones aren't met or they're falling short or not delivering, you always have the opportunity to discontinue a grant based on, are they hitting the mark in terms of the expectations and the deliverables and requirements, which is one, I think, an important factor to consider.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to deal with high-speed rail separately. So let's bring up in categories, the transportation and sustainable communities. The Secretary of Transportation, come on down. The Strategic Growth Council and ARB, Mr. Corey, you can stay there. And we'll do the transportation and sustainable communities first. So all three of you together. I will, if the LEO, you want to come up here? Come on up with us. Same with finance. Just right here on the side, on the dais.
That's a good idea.
I think we should have, because many of the questions at this stage will probably apply to all of you. There, the chair's there. All right, so first we have the Secretary, we have the Transportation Agency, if you'd like to begin, and then...
Good morning. I'm Mitch Weiss, Deputy Secretary at the Transportation Agency. I'm here with Chad Edison, also Deputy Secretary at the agency. As listed on your agenda, we'll be providing an update on the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program and the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. The Low Carbon Transit Operations Program was created to provide operating capital assistance to transit agencies in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve mobility. This program received $25 million in 14-15 and will receive 5% of proceeds in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund beginning in 15-16. Over 200 transit agencies and regional agencies are eligible for funding in this program. This funding is distributed by formula based on population and revenue generation. For agencies whose service areas includes disadvantaged communities, at least 50% of the total funding must be expended on projects that will benefit those disadvantaged communities. Caltrans released guidelines for this program on December 19th. Agencies had until the 2nd of February to submit applications for the initial cycle, and the funding will be distributed on April 15th. There will be a second cycle, and proposals are due on April 15th with funding distributed by June 30th. For the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, this is a competitive program which will provide grants to fund capital improvements and operational investments for projects that will modernize the state's transit and rail systems to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing vehicle miles traveled. This program received a $25 million appropriation in 14-15 and will receive 10% of the proceeds to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund beginning in 15-16. On February 6th, we published guidelines for this program. Applications are due on April 10th, and we will publish a list of approved projects by June 30th. In selecting projects for this program, we will select projects to achieve the programmatic goal of providing at least 25% of available funding to projects that provide a direct, meaningful, and assured benefit to disadvantaged communities. Your agenda contains a number of questions. I address them now. The first question is about the coordination with other departments. We've coordinated extensively with other departments. First, as these and other cap-and-trade funded programs were being developed, ARB convened biweekly meetings with the implementing departments, and we continue to hold these multi-agency meetings on a monthly basis. Our first step in implementing these two specific programs was to develop guidelines. We developed these guidelines in coordination with Caltrans, and we consulted with staff from ARB, Strategic Growth Council, High Speed Rail Authority, the Transportation Commission, and the Department of Finance. We also undertook a robust public participation process that included nearly a dozen public workshops and meetings, including presenting the guidelines at the meetings of the Strategic Growth Council and the Transportation Commission. We've worked closely with ARB staff on the greenhouse gas quantification methodology. Right now, for the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, Caltrans is working with ARB staff to determine project eligibility for the projects in the first cycle of funding. For the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, we will collaborate with other state departments in evaluating project proposals, working with staff from ARB, Caltrans, the High Speed Rail Authority, the Strategic Growth Council, and the Transportation Commission. The second question asks about the mechanism that will be used to evaluate if the grants resulted in greenhouse gas emissions. We'll monitor the progress and completion of each project through semi-annual reports to ensure those activities funded from auction proceeds are timely, within approved scope and cost, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are achieving other benefits included in the proposal. Once a project is complete, there'll be annual reporting to verify compliance with the greenhouse gas reduction requirements and the maintenance of other benefits claimed in the application. Caltrans will also include these programs in their existing audits of transit operators. I note that ARB is developing greenhouse gas quantification methods concurrently with program implementation, and they're continuing to work to refine and improve these methodologies. The third question asks what happens if projects do not achieve the anticipated level of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. As we noted earlier, all projects funded in these programs must further the purposes of AB 32. They're expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we take this quite seriously. The guidelines were constructed so that greenhouse gas emissions should be achieved if the program criteria and grant conditions are met. One of the unique things about this program is in instances, for example, in a capital program where you're purchasing buses, implementing a new rail line, there's an opportunity to work with the agency to redeploy those assets if they're not achieving the benefit they expected.
Opportunity to redeploy?
Certainly. So if a bus route is put in place and they anticipate a certain level of ridership and that's not achieved, we don't expect them to retain that route for 15 years of the life of the bus. We want to work with them to better utilize those assets and maximize ridership and greenhouse gas benefits. The subcommittee asked several questions about project selection. The Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, because it distributes funding by formula, inherently achieves a geographic balance. For the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, we're required by statute to consider geographic equity in evaluating the grant applications. In this program, we will evaluate applications for compliance with the program objectives and rate them based on a number of primary and secondary criteria. Greenhouse gas reductions is, of course, a core statutory requirement of this program and is one of the primary evaluation criteria we'll be considering. In evaluating matching funds, we'll be looking at two things. The first is leveraging and coordinating of funding from other greenhouse gas reductions program. The second is leveraging and coordination with the discretionary funds. Regarding the time to complete a project, we'll be considering project readiness and the reasonableness of the project schedule when we're evaluating the projects and selecting projects. Naturally, a project that's completed first is going to deliver benefits earlier. The last question asked about the type of project funding requests we received. We've received 22 requests in the first round of funding in the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. We've received requests to fund increased bus service through new bus routes, such as connections to a ferry terminal and service to connect a disadvantaged community to a shopping area. We've also received funds requests to increase bus service through increased frequency of routes and expanded hours of existing routes. Another example is a fare reduction program that would target ridership growth in disadvantaged communities. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I think we'll move to the Strategic Growth Council, and I'll keep all questions when we're finished this group. So Strategic Growth Council. You can stay. Yeah, there are plenty of mics. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Chair Wilk, members.
Yeah, I do. No, they're up here. Okay. All right.
We good?
Yes, we're good.
Thank you very much, Chair Wilk and members. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about the Strategic Growth Council's implementation of the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities portion of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. What we're doing here is creating a transformational change in the pattern of development in our cities and in our small towns to accentuate the location of housing in areas where transit is available and or walking, bicycling, and other non-motorized modes of travel could be undertaken by the residents. The program is based on very well known and understood scientific research regarding the relationship between housing, density of housing, the distance of housing from transit, and the availability of safe walking and biking routes. So the National Academy of Sciences, our own nation and world-leading University of California transportation scientists, and many others have published peer-reviewed documents on these subjects, and they are the basis of our understanding of how this program will work. In the process of locating housing near transportation and creating assets for active transportation, we are also emphasizing affordable housing development and the development of these programs in areas with disadvantaged communities. We are committed to having at least 50% of our funds go to affordable housing in these settings where greenhouse gas reductions can be achieved. And we are also committed to seeing 50% of these funds as a floor be distributed for these purposes in disadvantaged communities. We also hope to achieve co-benefits along with basic vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas reductions, and those include environmental improvements, health improvements, jobs, and economic development, all which can result from this type of stimulus in core downtown areas. We developed guidelines for this program, began immediately after you passed the budget bill last year. And we held many public hearings on this, worked a lot with constituent groups, and came to agreements about what the most feasible and attractive and beneficial investments would be, always keeping in mind that greenhouse gas reductions are first and foremost in the program. In January, the Council, Strategic Growth Council, approved these guidelines, and we issued a notice of funds available to attract concept proposals. And the concept proposals, as you can well understand, that a full proposal for this kind of a project would be a massive undertaking. We wanted to make sure that we only invited the best of the best to submit full proposals to us. We circulated this notice of funds available in January, and in February we received 147 concept proposals from all over the state of California. Of those, 105 were deemed to be eligible under the guidelines. This being a first-year program, there's a pretty big lift for communication about the precision of what was being asked for and what was being submitted. We think that this ratio will probably improve over time, but we ended up with 105 programs that met the eligibility requirements and the guidelines. Then we looked at leverage. We think that these dollars are precious, and we want to use them in a way that can give us the greatest greenhouse gas reduction per dollar. And so we went through the 105 proposals and ranked them for the amount of leverage that we could verify that they had in their project. We're very pleased to say that the average leverage of the 54 programs we have invited to final competition is 5-to-1. So we really think we can make a bigger greenhouse gas reduction per your dollar invested than we could had we not leveraged as effectively. These projects are distributed across 12 metropolitan planning organizations, 22 counties, and reach both rural and urban California. Projects include things like housing connecting to MetroLink at a bus hub. You can imagine the reductions available if you found yourself not in the suburb with your car, stranded to get to work, but rather having a choice of transportation options that could take you anywhere in the Los Angeles basin. Your desire to take a car might be greatly reduced. I know I have found that travel in Los Angeles is becoming increasingly enjoyable by public transit systems, and I haven't rented a car in my last 6 trips down there. So I think we have some real winners in those kind of projects in the Los Angeles area. We have bicycle and pedestrian safety programs which lead to transit and connect existing affordable housing to transit centers, with the estimation that this will create an increase in ridership for those transit stations that are adjacent to that housing. We altogether believe, we haven't tallied this up completely yet, these results came in just 2 weeks ago, so there's still a bit of parsing to do, but we think we have somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 units of affordable housing in this packet of applications. And as I said before, these stretch not only into what we think of as our major urban centers, but also to Stockton, Tulare, Bakersfield, Fresno, and van pool systems for farm workers throughout the valley. So it's broad and extensive in its reach. And we feel that the program as it stands now is a very good start. We do anticipate revising the guidelines in year 2. We're going to learn a lot as we go through this first phase with applicants, but we're confident that we've done well, and we're also confident that we can improve. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll deal with the Air Resources Board next, and then questions from the committee to after we finish the 3 on in transportation and sustainable communities, and then questions. So, Air Resources Board, well, Richard, there you are. Mr. Coy, welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. I'll address each of the 3 questions on page 15 of the agenda regarding ARB's $200 million for low-carbon transportation. With regard to the first question,